Cyrus, the doctor said from across the red oak desk. How are we doing today? Cyrus blinked against the blur, swallowing behind the leather strap at his throat. Thick muscles pulled against the restraints of the cushioned high-back chair opposite the doctor. Be better if your goons don't drug me every time they brought me here for our chats, he sneered, eyes settling on the elevator to his right before sweeping over the shelves of books behind the doctor. Yes, well, you've proven to be dangerous. The doctor's smile cut the blur of her face. And we wouldn't want to hurt your doctor, now would we? She leaned back in the swivel chair, fingers lacing atop the desk as she swiveled closer. Her edges swam into the background, but she was plain to see. The room was dim and dark. Dark wood, dark books, dark floor, dark wallpaper, but her pale skin made her a sickly nebula. Can't blame a man for trying to earn his freedom. Sure I can, she chuckled sweetly, dark lips curling into a grin as pale eyes drank him in. Every scar, freckle and sunspot on his bronze skin, every callus on his working hands, every strand of golden hair and ginger beard. Just tell me what you want to know so I can get back to my cell, woman. Don't you cherish our time together? She leaned forward on the desk, smiling. Oh, that I could. Well, I do. If I did, there'd be a lot less for you to enjoy, Doctor. She chuckled. Such fire! Good. We'll get to business then. Have you had any dreams since last time? Cyrus shook his head. What about daydreams? Random thoughts or scenarios that pop into your head, like the memories of dreams? I've thought about strapping you to this chair plenty, she sighed, opening a pad and jotting down notes. Put aside your need to be in control of everything and answer the question, please. Any sudden thoughts that wouldn't be something you normally think, that doesn't concern my disfigurement, preferably? I don't care how much you prefer it. Cyrus, you got me holed up prisoner in God knows where, strapped to some chair, threatening my family if I don't cooperate, and you want me to be calm? He sneered, nostrils flaring as heat swelled in his hands and face. You'll let me talk how I want, or you'll hear diddly. It ain't like I prefer to be here like this. They stared into each other's eyes, crystal blue clashing with honey gold. The air thickened, chilling until she smiled and unlaced her fingers in a wide, arching gesture as she sat back with a grin. Speak, then. Tell me of your visions. She licked her lips. Have you had any more waking dreams after all? 2. Tell me about them. She pushed her phone to the middle of the desk, her recorder slowly ticking down the minutes of their session. Cyrus, tell me about your visions, or you'll get no news about Sarah, Magdalene, or Geoffrey. His eyes bored into her blurry face, scowling as his family flashed in the back of his mind. Sweet Sarah in her autumn sundresses, flowers in her auburn hair, brown eyes alive with flecks of green and gold over pale skin dotted by freckles. Curious Magdalene with her dresses and makeup when she was with Mummy, and overalls, boots, and dirt when she was with him. Quiet Geoffrey, always sitting on the porch with a child's book, or sat beside him on the couch, begging for one more story, or one more ride on Cyrus's shoulders, or silently working beside him in the garden and smiling every time Cyrus praised him. Cyrus's face was stone as he glowered at the woman. Sometimes she was clear enough to see veins through the skin. Others so distorted she was nothing but a mass before a mass. He breathed deeply as she smiled, her teeth whiter than the rest of her, and set up a metronome, eyes closing and wagging a finger in the air in time with it. To help you, she said before leaning back, crossing her legs under the desk. Now, please, indulge me. He closed his eyes and sighed, letting the memory settle into the black with the distant, persistent rhythm. Tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. We were in the darkness. You and the other two? The bright man and the pale woman? Yeah, Cyrus flicked open his eyes. You gonna let me talk? She motioned for him to continue with a smirk, and he shut his eyes, the metronome swaying him through the memory. He stood with the bright man beside him, tall as Cyrus but made of blinding white light, rippling over and around him like dawn, the air turning to rainbow mist a foot over his skin. They looked into a black void, arms crossed as the floor writhed, the body of a massive black snake rolling on itself like its head had just been chopped off. Is it over? The woman asked at the bright man's other shoulder, her voice calm, clear, and low. You killed her, the bright man said bitterly. So I'd say it's over. No. Cyrus swept out an arm, glowing like molten gold and silver. She's still writhing. It's finished here, but the rest of her doesn't know it yet. The rest of her could return. Then what? The woman asked as the bright man turned and walked behind them. She was tall as Cyrus, body lithe and slender with shining pale skin and hair down to her hips like liquid night. Their eyes locked. If she comes back, the bright man said, then we can't just stand here and fight her each time. What if we die? Everything we will have done would be for naught. We need a way to keep her out, the woman said, still looking at him with raven eyes, brow furrowing in thought. What could keep her out? The bright man asked, still facing away, staring into more writhing oblivion, the whole of black eternity alive with the grate of skin on skin. Even the sun couldn't withstand her on his own. It took all of us. Even me. He almost hissed the last, skin bristling with veins of light. Cyrus stared at the ground, the black scales motionless where they stood. Or maybe we moved with the ground, Cyrus thought. I don't know. Where is the sun? The woman asked, turning around to scan the horizon. A distant, fearsome glow crested between two monstrous lengths of writhing body. 100 claps of thunder filled the darkness as light flared, arching around it and catching on the niches of the monstrous corpse. He's eating, the bright man said sternly, never looking over his shoulder, long, glowing braid falling down his spine. What about her? Cyrus thought aloud. Me? The woman asked, hair flowing back from her bare chest as color filled the cheeks. The bright man chuckled as light sparked. Why not? Mother, not her. The bright man looked over his shoulder, eyebrow arched and eyes like lasers. Whatever. Look around. It's writhing, crashing, pummeling itself. It isn't hurt. Cyrus swept out his hand, golden light building around him as his heart raced. It's the ultimate protection. And her blood? The bright man turned, arms still crossed as his light grew, trying to swallow Cyrus's golden aura. It's already risen to taint our plans, and we haven't even made them yet. What of it? Cyrus asked, his warm light turning to heat. We can't stack her body up to make a wall, the woman said, stepping closer with one hand up for the bright man to stop. The blood will drain and the shades will come. It was a nice idea, though. The bright man and Cyrus stared into one another for a long, silent moment, the pale woman looking between them and their shining eyes. Then the bright man's gaze drifted over Cyrus's face, brows furrowing as he grinned. What if? His arms fell, eyes trailing the ground. What if there wasn't any blood? No blood, no shades. What do you want? To carve her open and bleed her in long strips? It'll still rot. The woman nearly rolled her eyes. In the battle. The bright man held his chin. Your light. It was like mine for a moment. Intense, powerful, hot. Cyrus pointed a shining golden finger at him, stepping closer with a grin. Her flesh, wherever you touched it, it petrified, broke off and fell, the woman continued, perking up between them. But it didn't break on her body. Cyrus smiled. They all smiled. We'll need that light again. The woman looked between them. From one or both of you. One. Cyrus gestured to the bright man. You've always been brighter, brother. And who am I to leave her to stack all the stone alone? He smirked, and the bright man smiled wickedly, clapping his hands together. They glowed hot as his eyes, climbing until that light swallowed him and bleached the black world. Then start the collection, and quickly. I should be able to shine like that in half the time now that I'm recovered. Cyrus smiled. Of course you can. Tick. Tock. Tick. Cyrus sighed in the chair. It all sort of blurs from there. We make giant blocks by charring the meat, essentially. That's imaginative, the doctor said, monotone. You wanted to know. After a silence, he continued. Me and the woman, we pulled the blocks up, we had wings all of a sudden, I think, and set them on top of each other. A wall? The doctor asked. No, I think it turns into a dome, or... no, a sphere. A sphere? He nodded. We built down, moved some of the snake out of the way, and laid the blocks. I don't know why. That's fine. Just continue. She motioned to him absently as she checked that her phone was still recording. He swallowed with a nod, brows furrowing as the metronome swayed through him, each tick like the flip of a page, dragging him deeper into the vision. Tick. Tock. Tick. Tock. Tick. Tock. He stood over the oblivion, molten light beaming around him as he stared at the writhing horizon and sighed. Flashes of light raged in the back of his mind. The serpent's mouth snapping at him, rows of serrated teeth blackened from its fiery breath. He swallowed, unseeing eyes falling as the battle flickered to life before him. The flames had surrounded him, mingling with his light as he stood in front of the pale woman. He looked over his shoulder, ignoring the pain as she skidded back with wide eyes gleaming with pale flame. He'd snarled, he'd roared, then his body drank the fire, and he stood to the rearing serpent's eye, hands at its throat and horns. His lips parted around a pant, eyes flicking back and forth on the horizon as hands became fists at his sides, wings bristling on his back, light rising off him in ripples. But the scene played on. The serpent had bitten his shoulder. He'd screamed, banishing the silence as he bore his teeth. The scream became a yell, became a bellow, as he grabbed the thing's horns and pulled until the joint of its jaw was flush with his burning, bloody shoulder, sliding the fangs free. Its white, bottomless eyes widened, voice muffled and cursing as thuds came from behind. He'd spun, rolled, and looked up in time to see the pale woman. She'd grown, tall as the serpent with wings burning blacker than the void, sheening like gasoline. Her hair trailed behind her as she leapt, hands and feet outstretched, dexterous claws on each, and slender face sharp and long. Her lips peeled back and feline fangs locked onto the snake's throat with a broken yell. She'd flapped her wings, dredging them up, her claws dug deep, head shooting back and tearing away chunks of flesh. Atop the wall he licked his lips. Eyes wide, nostrils flared as the wind caught his wings and pulled him into the blackness, just as the scenes pulled him into memory. The pale woman, she'd screeched and cursed the serpent, snarled as she'd sunk her fangs in the side of its neck. The serpent looked at Cyrus, and its alligator lips smiled. He'd shot to his feet, panting, burning, leaping as the serpent opened its maw, the light of flame filling its mouth. He'd caught her jaw as a column of fire exploded into the ether, blinding him. The pale woman screamed and fell back. In the haze, he'd thrown its head onto the ground with a wet slap and screech, horns piercing its own side. The pale woman had stood, face burned and bleeding white. She'd snarled as the flesh stitched itself back together, strand by strand. Her onyx eyes flashed with 100 gemstone colors. Her wings lifted her over the ground as the sound of the sun bounded, landing on the serpent, sinking its teeth in and tearing like white fire shaped into a ferocious war dog. The pale woman glided over the serpent's head, wings covering it. She whispered. The snake laughed, something deep from her guts that made the whole roiling body shake. Then it came softer, then muffled. Then the snake writhed, thick muscular coils arching around the pale woman to crush her, to pry her away, to tear her apart. Cyrus had taken the scaly flesh in hand, pushing it away with his feet, gripping hard as he could to keep the pale woman clear. He'd squeezed his eyes shut, teeth bared and snarling as he groaned and strained, surrounded by the tossing sea of serpentine waves like black coronas from a cold sun. "You had your chance, Mother," the pale woman said from beneath her feathers. "Now it's our turn." She reared up and lifted the serpent's skull, the flesh barely linking it to its body. It smiled. Pale fire sprayed from the tattered grey and black flesh that used to be its throat. "Hey!" Cyrus blinked, and the serpent was gone. The fire, the blood, the carnage were all replaced by the slender face of the pale woman. "Are you all right?" He swallowed and looked around. They were high above the floor of the void. Wind caught in both their wings, his white as bone and arcing rainbows, hers glossy black and glittering with deep purple and green in his light. She took his face and beat her wings, pressing their foreheads together, cool and warm. "It's over. You don't have to live in that place anymore." He nodded numbly, his hands rising to his shoulders, sliding to her nape, and holding them together, wings out, but barely catching the frigid winds. "Thank you," he breathed. She hugged him tighter before pulling away with a sad smile. "Let's finish this, yeah?" Light exploded from the ground, white and burning, flooding the basin they'd made in the mass of dead snake. It flowed in like water, shifting in unseen currents, one over another, becoming green flames that cast up wails and screams. They both stared, pulling apart as they descended, landing on the ground before one of the 7 gates to keep out the serpent, and gawking at the inferno within. Amethyst, pearl, jade, and sapphire writhed around tall black figures, screaming amid the roar of the flame, twisting and stretching like solid smoke. Their brother stood in the massive archway, bathing in the light of the flames, his hair flowing in its dry wind. "What did you do?" the pale woman screamed over the choir of flame. The shining man looked over his shoulder, face stern and still as he swiveled on his heels and stalked closer, leaving the fires on the black things, stretching taller and thinner as they burned until they were consumed into nothing, taking their cries with them. "This one was flying and watching us work, and then the both of you decided to have a vacation. So I did what we were supposed to do and sealed the gaps in the block with her blood. Only the shades rose and tried to rush me. I had to burn them all." He flicked an emotionless face at both of them, jaw tense and arms falling before he smirked and lifted his arms in a shrug. "But it worked out in the end, I suppose. I was going to burn it all anyway, right?" They stared at him, the pale woman crossing her arms and ruffling her wings. "Had you waited for us and remained where you were meant to be, you needn't have been assailed by the shades at all." "And leave the work to sit idle?" The shining man's light grew, eclipsing the green torrent in the basin. Forbid you exercise patience over ego for once in your life, Cyrus said, skin hot and rippling gold-and-silver waves, steaming in the cold ether. The green flames rushed back on an unfelt wind as their brother's light rose, white and hot and sterile, face twisting in a murderous scowl. Need I remind you, the both of you, that precious little time we have to construct this fortress? Cyrus gritted his teeth, light flickering like fire as his skin whirled in golden channels and molten veins. His brother smirked, light dimming until Cyrus could see behind him and stared. The light and heat gone back into the furnace in his gut. The green flames twisted, pulsing to the center of the basin in tides like a speeding heartbeat. It collected at the center, swirling around itself until it crested into a mountain. Cyrus moved his brother aside, eyes wide and mouth parted as he watched the flames dance faster and faster, swirling in a whirlpool. A pillar of fire shot into the ether, cracking like lightning on a burst of wind that blew them all back. Cyrus spread wing, crouching before launching up and landing atop the unfinished wall of petrified flesh as the flames changed to blue, purple, yellow-orange, and white, casting colorful shadows across the writhing world. The flames flowed into themselves, its thunderous roars becoming groans as the pillars plunged into the basin, rippling like water. The bright man and pale woman landed next to Cyrus, staring before their brother growled, "It's boring through the stone!" He made ready to leap in, but the pale woman caught his arm. "No, it can't! It's tougher than her scales, remember?" The flames receded into the basin, drawing in themselves at the bottom, folding, knitting together. They jumped, landing on the incline and gripping the wall to slide on the curve after the retreating flames. The pale woman took wing and hovered ahead of them as the flames stopped, blazing white and compact as a star for a moment, then in the shape of a man, then darkness and plumes of steam. She landed beside it, wings back, cradling it as they arrived. A man. An ash-white man, naked, lithe, and slender, with copper locks long as the pale woman's, steaming like a boiling pot. He opened his eyes, crimson, orange, and gold all playing together, and stared up at her. He smiled. Tick. Tock. Cyrus blinked and swallowed as she helped the man sit up, asking who he was, while the newcomer asked the same. Tick. Tock. Cyrus looked over his shoulder and stared. A woman, a solid silhouette of black, stood stock still. He faced her. She tilted her head. Tick. Tock. Which is that one? Her whispering voice came from all round. Why build so many? She lifted her arm backward until her shoulder should have torn, and pointed to the archway behind her. Tick. Tock. He looked up, mouth coming open as the world blurred into black silence, save for the archway and the nagging ache at the back of his skull. Tick. Tock. The world blinked and changed like someone flipped the light on in a dark room. The portal towered 3 stories over him, once yawning gates now shut by bone-white doors braced in glittering gold. Silver plates bolted to their faces as each displayed battle and creation. It arced with gentle light, flares and rainbows blooming and dying like flowers, reflecting off the doors in glittering stars. The plates read from top to bottom on each door, the top right showing the bright man carving out from the serpent, then his fight, then all of them. Then the next was the birth of the Hound of the Sun. Then the half-finished walls of night at the end of everything with a man's birth, the Burning Man. The completion of the walls, fighting back dark figures and monsters from beyond at the open arches before strange gods came forward to help. And finally, the setting of the shining gates. The scenes shifted as Cyrus crossed his arms, his molten light mingling with the gate's gentle but persistent glow, humming on the air like a child's song. The scenes made no noise, but the longer he stared at the shifting images, the clearer the sound rang in his ears, reaching back from memory, flashing behind his eyes. He tensed his jaw, tears silently spilling over. He stepped forward, eyes falling on the red amethyst and silver system of rings locking the doors, dotting down their height. The topmost was near the lintel, the second was dead center, and the third was near the glittering black stone floor. He crouched, fingers trailing over the ancient glyphs carved into the rings, rings within rings within rings around a slitted keyhole, positioned like tumblers. He sighed, pressing his molten hand flat on the keyhole, the light flaring like a burning wheat field, thinking, everything we did. And I'm still here. He whipped his head to the left and stared, wide-eyed at the featureless face of the black silhouette, skin drinking the light, giving no sign of shadow or depth. He opened his mouth to speak, jumping to his feet. Someone called his name. His face whipped to the little square doorway carved into the black stone wall opposite the gates, and the pale woman emerging from it, then back to the silhouette. It was gone. He found the pale woman and smiled. Her hair was braided and woven onto her head, laced with gold and silver in the shape of a crown, emeralds dangling on her forehead. "What are you doing here?" she asked, taking his face in her slender hands and searching his shining eyes. Her black wings came around him like a cloak and pulled them together, nestling her face against his shoulder. "Are they troubling you?" He nodded, arms trailing up her sides over the white and silver gown, fingers mingling in her sheer mint veil as he stared into the ancient child-sized square in the wall leading out of the chamber. "Why do you say nothing? I will always hear you. I always have." "I know, my love." His voice was a breath as he looked over his shoulder at her black feathers. "But I couldn't help it. After all this time walking among them, the doors are sealing, but these two..." She stepped away and pulled his face down, kissing his forehead as her wings opened and settled at her back. "Come away with me. This place will sour both of us if we remain." "Does it not concern you?" She smiled sadly and nodded. "Of course it does. But these doors have held for how many thousand years? And there's been none to rise up to the path of the Banes, not even among our kin." "It isn't our kin that worry me. Not always," he smirked. "But beyond, the doors have been silent for too long. The shades have been unseen for too long. My love, something stirs." She kissed his lips chastely and stroked his cheek with her thumb. "Silence doesn't mean scheming. It could mean peace." "I want it to, truly. But have we ever known her to rest while we stand?" He took her hand on his cheek and stroked her knuckles, turning his face into her palm to kiss it and pull her fingers to his chest. "Peace is not something she knows, nor the shades of her, nor their beasts. All she touches turns to nothing." "Then let it be nothing, my heart." She twined their fingers and held them at her lips. "Come away with me, and let what's hers remain beyond. She'll never claim what we've made." He stared into her eyes and smiled, cupping the side of her face and kissing her, breathing her in before pulling apart. "We'll walk again soon. I shouldn't waste our time alone here. I should be with you. Come, be with me." She walked backward, leading him by their twined hands to the square door, and emerged into the shadows of the labyrinth's gigantic walls. She opened her wings and let go as light flowed off him, coalescing behind into his own pair. They crouched and launched above the walls, taking wing and gliding in silence over the miles of dead ends, traps, monsters, and illusions. His smile had faded in the vaulted caverns of the labyrinth, burning eyes studying the paths below and the scant skeletons of the few who dared try find the western bane of chaos. The monstrous creatures they'd trapped there eons ago still roamed, fed by the cave itself and their own flesh when they happened upon one another. There used to be a tribe of shades hiding in the western labyrinth when it was young, where they hadn't been seen since the Adom had won fire. A shadow stirred and spilled up one of the walls ahead of them, standing like a man. No, not a man. A woman. The silhouette watched him, face up like a flower after the sun as he flew over. Ahead, she stood atop another wall, watching him, and flicking to the meagre door to the edge of the world. They passed over her, and she rose again ahead of him, further and further, until she stood beside another small square in the black stone wall, swallowed by the labyrinth's darkness. As they beat their wings to slow, the silhouette turned and merged within the shadows in the portal. They landed wordlessly as they'd flown, and stooped under the rough-hewn lintel to emerge in the antechamber of white marble and salt, heading for the gold and red door opposite them. They walked through it into the western halls, the twin of the east and his brother's domain, and followed its twists and turns until they stopped before the descending stairs to the underworld's western gate. The little mortal souls of the dead streamed in from the fairies at port above them, having followed the shepherds through the western halls for the last port of the waking world. They were as they had been in life, appearing as flesh, though of a different sort, and bare as the hour of their birth. The old, the young, the strong, the bold, the foolish, men, women, and children, slaves and kings, prisoners and wardens, they all walked as equals down the steps of the dead, and would stand as such before their judges. Some looked around with wonder, others horror or fear. Some covered their nakedness, while others seemed to have forgotten it altogether. The pale woman greeted them, staring into their eyes to know them and wish well those she knew would meet no torment. The rest she merely greeted with their names, and told them to expect her soon. He chuckled silently to himself, wrapping his arms at his chest, eyes trailing her hands and face as she crouched before a weeping child. She was young for mortals, barely at the knees of the rest, and head a mess of thick hair as she gripped the pale woman's hand and sobbed. She met the girl's eyes and wiped her tears away, lilting her head to one side with a sad smile. She looked up at the soul of a muscly man, hands free at his sides as he spun with an open smile, drinking in the halls. Their eyes caught for a brief moment, and he froze, swallowing at the gravity of her face. She took his hand and held it like iron, pulling him forward until they were face to face. "I am queen of all that is below, so hear me now." The man stared with wide eyes at the kneeling giant before him, but nodded in respect. "This child shall be your charge until she is seen after in my realm. Understand? You were a soldier in life. Let it have been of worth if only to see this girl before the thrones of judgment." Tick. Tock. Cyrus looked up at the steps and stared at the silhouette looking back at him, then down the steps where the doors of death would see the souls through. Tick. Tock. "Yes, ma'am," the soldier said, standing straight. She stood and kissed the girl on her forehead as the silhouette turned back to Cyrus and tilted her head. "Go, dearest one. You'll find peace hereafter, and your mother will return to you in due time. But you will not be alone." Tick. talk. They turned and walked into a vaulted circular room of rough-hewn stone, with cardinal white marble braces leading to a circular port of Stygian iron at the apex. The Hound of the Sun etched in gold on the doors. "He's going to be a problem," Cyrus said, crossing onto the brazen grated floor. Tick. Tock. "He already is," the pale woman said, taking wing and gliding to the other side of the room to pull a wooden handle on a chain. The Stygian doors slid into the earth, revealing a short tunnel and the dancing stars above. "He can't be fooled forever. What does Eradu intend to do with him?" he asked. "You're up here with him more than I am," she said, gliding to the open port. "He flew after her. He doesn't trust me, I think. Or maybe he doesn't know himself." "Heirs of majesty." Tick. Tock. He opened his mouth to speak as they crested the tunnel, emerging on an open field of grass and rock beneath sapphire skies of wild, listless stars. A shadow caught his eye. He froze, facing the solid silhouette standing at the edge, looking up at him as he rose above the ground. "Cyrus?" Its voice came muffled. "Cyrus!" Tick. Tock. Cyrus flung his eyes open and gasped, fingers scraping the arms of the chair, thrashing as he wildly scanned the dim room, shouting and arcing against the restraints. "Cyrus!" the doctor said at his side, pulling open his eyes and flashing them with light. "Cyrus, can you hear me?" He groaned against the ache worming through his skull as he flicked to the doctor's white face, her bottomless silver eyes. He looked over her head and furrowed his brow. She'd moved him, turned the chair to face the painting of two wolves. "Cyrus!" She patted his cheek. "What?" he scowled. Tick. Tock. What did you give me?" His eyes flittered and rolled back as he gasped, body convulsing. Tick. Tock. "Don't you die!" The doctor's voice rushed him alongside the metronome. His voice rung in his ears, a familiar but strange hum in the darkness, getting closer every second. He opened his eyes on a workbench with scrolls rolled neatly to one side. 3 stone jars, of amber, red jasper, and white marble against the far edge to the wall, and an earthen pot covered with cloth and wood plank opposite the scrolls. He turned, pulling his apron from the mounted hook beside the workbench and tying it over his shining, bare upper body as he spun to the island amid the workshop. He flitted glittering fingers over the utensils hanging from the iron rack fixed to the cottage's wooden beam, stopping at a copper pot and flicking it free. It clanked onto the workbench before he uncovered the earthen pot and pulled a glob of clay free. He filled half of the pot before wiping his hands across the apron and grabbing the amber jar, uncapping it over the bowl as the hum died in his throat. White light shone, filling the room and overpowering the warm glow of the western lamp atop the mountain of his island. He tilted the jar, and light fell like water, settling onto the clay. Setting it aside, he did the same with the red jasper, letting warm light flood the room and fall into the copper bowl, mingling with the first lights. His ears pricked as he returned the jar, reaching for the marble. Something treaded on the stones outside his door, filling the air with a chill, convulsing against the warm light like unseen lovers. Darkness promised to kiss his back. He smirked and uncapped the white jar, pouring pale mint-green liquid onto the clay, its edges hard and drinking in the mixing lights, changing them, softening them without dimming them. He returned the jar and bent, looking under the bench, pretending to search for a tool, then standing straight with a furrowed brow as he studied the utensils hanging on the rack. With a sigh, he walked to the southern wall and pulled open the simple wooden door, letting it shut behind him as he made a show of searching for something amid the neatly stacked tools on the shelves and the open cases of dry clay beneath. He looked between the wood boards, smirking as the front door opened opposite the workbench, and a shade crept over the threshold. It was shaped like a woman, hair braided down her back, skin like raven wings, eyes silver and black and slitted like a cat's, her legs bent like a doe. Her tunic was tied at the shoulder and wrapped with cord at her waist, leaving her sides and legs exposed as she looked around the cottage. Her brow furrowed between winding horns, slender tail flicking nervously as she crept around the island and came to the copper bowl. She smiled, clawed hands rising over it as Cyrus smirked. She looked around again, sinking a claw into her wrist and sneering with wolfish fangs as black ichor fell. "A firstborn," he thought. "Well, aren't you rare?" She bled at the edges of the bowl, just enough to taint the mixture without being seen, then held the wound to her mouth and let a long tentacled tongue snake over it. Her saliva sizzled in the ichor as the cut sealed with a graying scar. She smiled. Cyrus grabbed the handle of the door and cursed with false anger. She bolted, slipping through the front door like smoke and closing it noiselessly. He wrenched open the cellar door and slammed it behind him, light flaring as he stalked over to the copper bowl, suppressing a pleased smile. He sank his hands into the clay, kneading it, mixing the light, the pale, and the black with a breathy chuckle. The light dimmed, becoming soft and warm again as the gray clay became pink, red, and purple. "Finally," he said, the cold presence still outside the front door as he turned and pulled a stone mold from the island's top shelf, setting it gently onto the workbench. He retrieved the other half and set them upright, pressing the hollow sides together, sealing the edges with tar, and setting them with 7 leather belts. He uncovered a stone pot in the corner of the room, ladling out clear water onto the soft clay and kneading it. The cold vanished as wings beat the air. He turned, bowl in hand, as the pale woman opened his door, white gown flowing to her shins over shining bare feet, embroidered with pale green vines. Her black wings glittered in the light of his lamp, almost as brightly as her smile. "My love," he said, setting the bowl down and rushing to her. He stopped and smirked nervously. "And I'm covered in clay." She took his hands in hers despite the mess and pecked his lips. "Finish your project and clean up quickly, then." She spun him and pushed his muscular back until he was before his workbench once more. "As you say, my queen." They chuckled together as he poured the murry clay into the hole at the top of the mold. "Is this the project you've been so excited about? The one you told of to the whole world?" She poked his bare ribs. He nodded with a laugh. "He'll be the first of his kind. A creature whose spirit is of each of us, yet married to flesh, unlike beast or spirit, yet kin to both." He set the bowl down, wiping his hands across his apron and pulling it over his head to set it crumpled on the bench. "What will you call him?" she asked, stepping aside as he went to the water pot, ladling some into the wash bowl. "I'm not sure." He ran water over his nape, clay dripping from shining skin. "He'll be both spirit and flesh, made like god and beast. What do you think?" He stood upright, grabbing a towel as water dripped down his muscled body, soaking into the cord of his skirts at the hip. She bit her lip and leaned on the island, crossing her arms as she eyed him. He smiled, fire stirring between his legs as he wrapped his arms around her waist and hovered his lips over hers. She set hands on his chest, claws dragging as she leaned in to kiss him. He pulled his mouth back with a smirk. She rolled her eyes and smiled. "He came from Adamah. Call him Adam." "Perfect." He kissed her, letting her hands wander as he held her face and pressed her against the workbench. Tick. Tock. Something molten stabbed into his heart, flinging him back from the pale woman with a scream. Tick. Tock. He looked down, but there was nothing. Tick. Tock. His heart raced, pounding in his head like fire. He grabbed his temples and fell to the floor as everything dimmed. Screams came louder and louder as light burned under his skin. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It pounded in time with his heart, fire pressing against his skin like 1,000 little hands pulling him apart. He screamed, fingernails clawing down his face, falling to his side, writhing, mauling himself bloody. Tick, tock, tick, tock, tick, tock, tick, tock. His eyes flew open, ears ringing as he screamed, thrashing against the restraints and cold metallic slab at his back. His eyes flicked to his chest, wide as saucers and aching from the blinding lights. His shirt was torn, a syringe wrenched from his burning red chest. The doctor gripped his face, pale eyes staring, close enough to kiss. "I told you not to die!" Her lips peeled back in a scowl, showing long teeth before she tossed his face away and stood, straightening her pantsuit. She slicked back her hair until it was flush to her scalp, looking sternly at the wall before she smiled down at him, dark lips and veins standing out like worms against the sterile white tiles of the room behind her. "Today was very productive, Cyrus. The next time we'll take it slower," she said cordially. "We can't have our patients dying. What would people think?" She smiled wide, showing her teeth as crystal blue eyes looked him over and flicked up to someone behind him. "Ice bath and muscle relaxers." "As you say," a nurse said, white scrubs blending into the walls. The doctor gripped his hand, and he flinched at her cold fingers. "Sorry, cold hands, warm heart," she smirked. "We uncovered a lot today. A lot I wouldn't have expected. It was excellent." His breath came out in pants as wild eyes stared at her. "My family!" He gasped for breath, heart beating his ribs. "Ordeal! You said so!" She stroked his knuckles. "Yes, of course. They'll be safe for a good long while with what you've given me. And I'll have the surveillance brought in so you can see them. You won't believe how tall Joff is now." She whistled, smiled, and slithered from his grip. She turned. Black bun coiled at the back of her head and opened a chrome door with a tiny window. "All right, Cyrus," the nurse said, coming around and gripping the foot of the slab with a disinterested smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Time to bring down that temp or your brain'll boil." He pushed, muscles bulging under charcoal skin. Cyrus panted, tugging on the restraints. No, out! I'm done! Let me out!" "Please stop, Cyrus." The pressure in his head built until his skull should have burst. "Be silent!" he screamed, tearing his right arm free as a bellow exploded from his lips, morphing into his wife's name and words he didn't understand. "Jehensu horse!" The nurse covered his ears and winced, nearly doubling over as Cyrus arched his back, the leather straps at his chest and guts stretching, ready to snap. The nurse stumbled over to his face, charcoal eyes watering and red as he snarled, face twisting almost inhumanly, and punched Cyrus's jaw. His head crashed into the slab, his eyes rolled back, and the world went dark.